I think we're still waiting to move people. Admit all?
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give it a couple of minutes for folks to stream in, but if you're here for the offshore wind meeting, you're in the right place.
Hey Jeff, this is Heather. Man, I just wanted to let you know a lot of people are out fishing right now. I know this is geared toward the fishing industry, and some people will be likely connecting from the ocean. But I just wanted to share that with. And there's really no great time, right? There's always people fishing regardless, but the weather's super nice right now, and so I just wanted to give you a heads up. I don't think it's for lack of interest, but I don't want you to feel discouraged if you don't have a whole bunch of people on because of that.
Thank you. Actually, we're having two meetings tomorrow that are geared toward the fishing community specifically. The one tonight is more generally for members of the public to learn about the process and catch up to the conversation. I hope that's been clear in the outreach.
It probably was clear. I think I had told you I've been running nonstop. And so
Yeah.
I thought tonight was the fishing industry one, and I had shared it broadly. So we might have some of those people calling in too, but I will also remind people there's two meetings tomorrow as well.
Great. Yeah. And the one tomorrow, yeah, thank you. The one tomorrow is more specifically focused on fishing community interests and concerns we've heard, and then some specific questions that we have. So this one's going to be a little bit more general, and tomorrow will be more specific.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Sorry for the confusion.
Oh. All right. We've given it a couple of minutes here. I've seen a few extra folks come in. We'll just go ahead and get started. And as people stream in, we'll catch them up. Good afternoon, evening, everybody. My name is Jeff Burright. I am with the Oregon Coastal Management Program that is within the state agency, the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I'm here tonight to catch you all up to a conversation that's been happening here in the state for the last 7-8 months or so, as we are developing a roadmap for the state specific to offshore wind. And that is at the direction of the Oregon legislature from last year's legislative session. So my purpose here tonight is to let you know what the roadmap is, talk about where Oregon is with offshore wind and what we know at this point about what it possibly could be in the future if it were to come. I want to give you a look behind the curtain to some of the conversations that have been happening. And it is an open public process that we've been having to develop this roadmap. And then we have a portion of the evening as well where I'm going to open up the floor for any questions that you have. If you want to provide feedback for us, for the process, we're happy to hear that as well. And then we will adjourn after that. And I see we've gathered a few new people in. So if you're just joining, welcome. Again, I'm Jeff Burright with DLCD, and I'm here to talk about the offshore wind roadmap. I'm going to begin sharing my screen now, and I'll give you a little bit of information about the format that we'll be following here tonight. So as I mentioned, the agenda for the evening, the first piece, I'm going to talk for a little while. So I'm going to give you the information that we have on our process and offshore wind. And during that time, I'd like to ask that if you do have questions during the presentation, to save them until we get to the Q&A portion that comes after. However, the chat is open. So if you'd like to pose a question in chat to get in line to then ask those questions, Or if you just want to get in line to ask your question directly, you can use the chat for that function and just say, I'd like to get in the queue or ask your question. If you're more comfortable using the raise hand feature, you can do that too. And we, behind the scenes, will be just keeping track of the order in which people are putting their desire in to ask a question or to speak. So the chat is open, but we ask that the conversation in the chat not get too expansive, if that's possible, please. And whatever questions you have, we're going to try to get to them. Libby, Tammy from Consor are here to help me with the meeting this evening. And I also have with me my colleagues, Mandy McNabb and Cynthia Smith, who are part of the Coastal program as well. Before I get going on my presentation, is there anything, Libby, Tammy, Cynthia, Mandy, that we also ought to cover before we get going?
I think you're good, Jeff.
I think you
Okay.
covered it all.
Okay. I also wanted to point out that what you see on the screen right now has 2 QR codes. If you're interested, we do have a webpage that includes information about all of our past meetings, the roadmap, the materials, videos, all that stuff is there. And that's where we'll be posting information about the next meetings that we're going to have related to this roadmap. And then there's a QR code as well that if you'd like to sign up for our email list, we send out notices ahead of meetings. So it's a way to keep up with the process. So tonight, for what I'm going to be talking about, I want to cover where we are with offshore wind in Oregon, what the roadmap is, and why the state is making one. And then I'll bring you in on where we are in the process for developing the roadmap. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we started this last fall, and with a bill that just passed in this legislative session, we have a little more time to develop the roadmap. Originally, it was going to be due in September of this year, but we came to realize that doing this right takes more conversations than we were giving ourselves time for. And so thankfully, the legislature gave us some more time. So this process that I'm going to be describing here is going to be ongoing until probably about mid to end of next year. So you're catching it at a good time to hear some of the conversations that have been had so far, but while there's still time to shape the conversation that's still to come. I do also have some pictures that I want to show you and just some information about what we understand at this point about what offshore wind could look like if it were to come to Oregon, just to give us all kind of the same base of information. And then, as I mentioned too, at the end of my presentation, that's when we're going to open it up for you all to ask questions and speak your mind. So first, just a little bit about what the Oregon Coastal Management Program is, in case you're not familiar. We are housed within the Department of Land Conservation and Development, but we're actually a program that involves 11 state agencies, 28 coastal cities, and I think it's 8 counties along the coast. We are a large network of different agencies and authorities that all have a part to play in how the state manages the uses and the resources of the coastal zone from Oregon. Within DLCD, we are a planning agency for the state that is responsible for the state's land use system and how that is administered through local governments. And as part of that, our statewide planning goals have 4 goals that relate to the coast. We have one for estuaries, one for shorelands, beaches and dunes, and the open ocean. And as part of the open ocean goal, we have what's known as the Territorial Sea Plan that has some specific policies that apply to any potential uses of the ocean that would include offshore wind. We also assist local governments with planning for estuary management and hazards, et cetera. The coastal program also has a role when it comes to federal actions, and that includes the issuance of federal permits like you would need for an offshore wind project, as well as federal actions like leasing of the seafloor. we're given this authority from the federal level, the Coastal Zone Management Act, and it's handed down to the states. It's called the Federal Consistency Authority. And it gives the state an opportunity to weigh in on those federal actions before they happen, and gives us an opportunity to influence those actions as well. It's one of the state's biggest and best levers when it comes to offshore wind, and it's housed within our program. And it's one of the reasons why we are leading this roadmap effort. So I'm going to start with where we are with offshore wind in Oregon. And as an opener to that, I just want to touch for a minute on why we are looking for additional energy generation sources for the state. We do have clean energy goals as a state to achieve 100% carbon-free energy from our major utilities by, 2040, I believe. Sorry about that. And then alongside that, we also recognize that we have growth in the state in our energy usage, both from our population changing and from just the transition that's happening in our energy system as fewer people are driving internal combustion engine cars and switching over to electric, as heating and cooling in homes is starting to change toward heat pumps and other sources that use more electricity, and also the growth of data centers in the Pacific Northwest, which is a new and significant user of energy. Our sister agency, the Oregon Department of Energy, is right now working on an Oregon energy strategy that they plan to publish by November of this year. As part of that effort, they commissioned some studies of Oregon's expected energy demand growth over the next couple of decades. And what you see on the slide is an excerpt from a presentation that they gave in January of this year, where they showed that across the board in Oregon, as time goes on, we do see that energy demand might actually go down a little bit. However, that yellow bar that's really big, that shows the growth of our electricity demand. And the reason why you're seeing a lessening of overall demand, but a growth in electricity demand is, as I was mentioning, as we transition away from fossil fuels for some of our energy usage, we are putting more demand on electricity that is going through our transmission system. But kind of interestingly, as you are converting to electricity, you're getting more efficient. The amount of energy it takes to transport and use fuel is higher, and you can gain back some efficiency by having that energy go on your transmission grid. And so that's why you see that demand reduction. But the big picture here is that as a state, we expect our electricity demand to be growing significantly. And that means that we as a state need to find new sources of energy generation for ourselves. Where we are right now is represented in this figure. And this comes from a report that the Department of Energy in the state puts out every couple of years called the Biennial Energy Report. And this is a summary of where we get our electricity today. What you can see is that our biggest source of electricity comes from our hydroelectric system. The dams on the Columbia River and elsewhere provide about 40% of the energy that we use in the state. And we're fortunate to have such a large proportion of our energy already coming from a renewable source. Next in line is coal. Oregon doesn't have any coal burning plants in the state. This is energy that we are importing from other states like Wyoming, I think Idaho as well, a couple of others, to help meet our demand. We then have natural gas as a main contributor of our energy source as well, which is lesser carbon emitting, but still carbon emitting. And then along the top, you can see there are other energy sources that are much less significant in the state. We have wind power onshore right now. You can see that when you drive on the gorge. We get about 3.5% of our power from the nuclear station that's in the state of Washington that then gets imported into the state, and then solar and on down the line. So what I gather from this is that we have kind of a long way to go if we want to achieve our clean energy targets as a state. And then when you look offshore, something that has risen in people's awareness is that offshore Oregon is it's described as a world-class wind resource. We have strong, seasonal, consistent winds off the coast that, if they could be harnessed in a responsible manner, could work well with the way that we use energy in the state, where the winds blow harder in the winter and less in the summer, and that also matches the demand curve seasonally of our grid. It's been found that anything higher than an average of 15 miles an hour is viable for producing power, and you can find that anywhere off of Oregon's coast from north to south. So, and then additionally, when you're offshore versus onshore, there's a greater predictability to what the wind is going to be further in advance, which helps for energy grid system planning. And so there are some benefits that could assist the state if there was a way to harness that. However, because Oregon is on a steep shelf, in other words, the depth of the ocean drops off pretty rapidly, pretty quickly, anywhere that would be outside of state waters, the 3 nautical mile line, is going to be pretty deep. And whereas in Europe or on the East Coast, you would see offshore wind turbines that are on a pole stuck in the seafloor. In Oregon, what they're considering more likely would be floating offshore wind. So there would be floating platforms that are anchored to the seabed with very large structures on them that then would have a cable coming to shore. So it's a relatively newer technology than the seabed affixed style, and that brings its own challenges when you talk about developing something new for the state. So when thinking about why the state might be interested in pursuing offshore wind as part of our energy mix, there are 3 main legs of the stool that keep coming up in our conversations. One of them would be energy reliability and resiliency. On the coast, there are 5 power lines that cross the Coast Range, and there's no energy generation on the coast, west of the Coast Range. And so as studies have been done of the energy system, there have been some benefits that have been identified that if we could be producing energy on the west side, it could potentially increase the resiliency of the coast if there were disruptions along those 5 lines from wildfires or earthquake or storms, those kinds of things that can affect system reliability. And then also, just from generating more power in the state, you run a lesser risk of brownouts, energy demand, causing a disruption in power for people. There's the leg of the stool that is reducing the carbon cost of energy. If we had offshore wind off of Oregon, it won't single-handedly save the world or the ocean, but it would be part of the state taking responsibility for our own emissions and meeting our goals. And the third leg of the stool is economic development and jobs. If there were to be an offshore wind industry that is hosted off of Oregon, that would require a significant amount of work in the state, onshore and offshore, to produce the parts and components that you need to do installations and maintenance, and that's opportunity potentially for the coast that then could lead to further economic development. So starting in about 2019, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is a federal agency, they are responsible for issuing leases of the seafloor in federal waters for uses like oil and gas exploration, harvesting of critical minerals off of the seafloor, and renewable energy like offshore wind. So BOEM, the agency, started to receive inquiries from developers who were expressing interest in trying to find areas of least conflict off the Oregon coast where they could propose projects to be built. So BOEM started a task force that included state agencies, local governments, interested and affected parties, and other federal agencies to try to do that least conflict area identification. And where they started was with the entirety of the coast. They went north to south, and as far offshore as the developers thought the technology could go based on where we are today. And that's to a depth of about 1,300 meters. They then, from feedback from the state and others, decided that they would focus more on the south coast. And the main reason for that is because the winds are stronger there. And so if you're talking about the cost of energy and the return on your investment and the consistency, there is a perception that you can have cheaper electricity if you were to start there first. As part of their process, they went a layer deeper and they started looking at all the ways in which the ocean is already a busy place and areas that are in use from shipping and defense needs and fishing and all the existing uses that are out there, existing cables that are on the seafloor, and again looking at wind speed. And from that, they identified 3 kind of large areas off the coast. You can see those black outlines, one off of Coos Bay and north, and then one off of Brookings. There was a third one that got removed after people raised concerns about ecological fishing uses in the area. And so now we had 2 large areas that were called call areas. And they kept going and looked at various other data layers that are available related to what we know about where species are, what we know about where fishing is taking place, other endangered species or habitats, human uses, to try to narrow down even further from the places that they'd identified to date. And what you're seeing on the screen is just one example of the many different data layers they were looking at. Until finally, last year, or like late the year before, BOEM identified 2 areas that they called wind energy areas. And you can see there's one that they called the Coos Bay wind energy area and the Brookings wind energy area that are a subset of those larger pieces. The Coos Bay WIA is, or was, about 32 miles from shore, and the Brookings was about 18 miles from shore. And the intent of BOEM was to offer leases in these smaller areas for auction. But before they could do that, they needed to check in with the state. And this is where that federal consistency authority that I talked about in the beginning comes in, where before the federal government can lease the seafloor for this use, they needed to check with the state to see if that action would be consistent with our policies for how we want uses and resources of the coastal zone to be protected and used. What you see here on the screen, this rainbow bar chart, is how BOEM conducts their portion of offshore wind leasing and permitting from beginning to end. And it starts with that area identification. That's the process that I just talked you through that took about 4 or 5 years. And then this first yellow arrow happened last year. That was the state's first bite of the apple where we got to weigh in and say whether we agreed that the federal government could move forward with the action. Had it moved forward, there would have been a lease granted, and then it would have been a period of about 5 years where the lessee who had just purchased the rights to the seafloor would have the opportunity to go study what they just bought and then propose an application called a construction and operations plan to actually go build something out there. And that would be that second yellow arrow, that second opportunity for the state to look at the proposed project in its entirety with all the detail and then say whether that project is consistent with our policies or not. So the decision at the first yellow arrow is not a decision about whether to build an offshore wind project. It's just a decision of, can the government give basically first rights to a lessee and give them the opportunity to submit that project later. So this is where we were last year. As part of that, at that first arrow. And so we conducted a federal consistency review in the coastal program. We did meetings up and down the coast. We worked with our agency partners, and we worked with BOEM as well. And the end result was that we came to a concurrence with conditions. So when you do a federal consistency review, you can either concur and say, yes, the action as proposed is consistent with our policies and can move forward. Or you can do like a yes if, which is where we landed last year, where we had, I think, 19 conditions on BOEM to say, you can do this. However, it needs to come with certain actions and assurances to protect seafloor habitats, to coordinate with the state and tribes and fishing communities, and other affected communities along the way. Protection of species while they're out there doing their studies, that sort of stuff. The third option would be if the state came to a place where we said, we just can't get there. We cannot find this action is consistent with our policies, then we can issue an objection. And in the case of a permit, which was that second yellow arrow, if the state were to issue an objection, that permit can't move forward unless the applicant has a successful bid to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce saying that the national interest outweighs the state's objection. So this is really the state's big lever on the process. And a notable example from the last 5 or so years where the state did object and a project stopped was the Jordan Cove liquid natural gas export terminal that had been proposed some years ago. In that case, they were not able to obtain all the necessary permits. There were concerns about habitat mitigation and other things, and we objected. They appealed. They did not succeed in their appeal, and the project did not move forward. But in this case, last year, we landed on the concurrence with conditions. And at that point, we did expect that leasing was going to move forward, but then it didn't. So last fall, 4 out of the 5 eligible bidders decided not to proceed to leasing. They dropped out of the process. There were also some vocal concerns from communities in the process who felt that the process that BOEM had followed had left out some important areas that they should be avoiding, or had not addressed all of the concerns and questions that they had about what might come after leasing. And then on top of that, last year in the legislature was when the state decided that we needed to have a roadmap for ourselves, where we took a look at the policies that we have to make sure that they're actually up to the challenge of offshore wind. So when you put all that together, the Oregon governor sent a letter to the Secretary of the Interior asking that leasing be postponed until after the state had completed our roadmap. And to their credit, that request was honored and the leasing was postponed, did not happen last year. However, at the time, the governor made some statements regarding offshore wind. First off, recognizing and highlighting that we do have clean electricity goals as a state, and that in order to achieve those goals, we need to have a lot of options on the table for how we reach that goal, and that she wanted to see offshore wind remain one of those options into the future. However, she recognized that there are both challenges and opportunities that need to be worked out, and that while it is challenging, it's worth a try. Meanwhile, down to neighbor in the South, California, they have some pretty aggressive goals for offshore wind. They're trying to achieve 25 gigawatts of capacity by 2045. And in order to do that, they're working to identify lots of areas of sea space and build an industry for themselves to move forward in that. California did move forward with leasing in 2022 and identified 5 lease areas that you can see on the map there, one off of Eureka and one off of Morro Bay, that have multiple leases within them. However, those lease areas are not enough to meet their goals, so they have quite a long ways to go yet to achieve their goals. And then one last thing to catch you up to where we are with offshore wind right now is to recognize that under the new federal administration, there has been a significant policy shift as to whether the government should be issuing leases for offshore wind. There was a day one executive memorandum from the president in January that withdrew all areas of federal waters from offshore wind leasing until they could conduct a reevaluation of the basis for those actions. They also put a halt on any new permits, rights of way, easements, et cetera, related to offshore and onshore wind. So leasing didn't proceed in Oregon. And based on the current federal direction, it doesn't look like leasing is coming back to Oregon anytime soon. So then that leaves us in a place to say, well, why is the state doing a roadmap right now? That's what I want to talk about next. So, as I mentioned, in the legislature last year, early mid 2024, at the time, we were expecting that leasing was likely to happen or could happen, and realized that we wanted to be ready for participating in that federal process with as much leverage as we could have as a state. And House Bill 4080 in that legislative session had a few things in it. First off, it had some labor standards that were directly applicable to offshore wind projects and any port development that would happen related to it. And the other big piece was that it directed my agency, DLCD, to lead this offshore wind roadmap effort to identify what standards we ought to have for ourselves as a state when it comes to offshore wind. And a piece of that is a directive for us to evaluate our enforceable policies for offshore wind, to make recommendations about areas where we might have some gaps. And those enforceable policies are, as was described to me by the federal agency, NOAA, the field on which the game is played when it comes to the state's federal consistency authority. So we wanted to take the opportunity to sharpen our tools and make sure that they were adequate to the challenge. The House bill had some specific direction to us on what ought to be in a roadmap. And specifically, it required us to define standards to be considered in processes related to offshore wind development and approval. And it had some topic areas that those standards have to support. And that includes effective stakeholder engagement, support for local and regional coastal communities, as well as coastal economies, both creating new economic opportunities and sustaining existing local and regional economies. The roadmap needs to have standards that lead to the creation of an offshore wind workforce that is trained, housed, and equitable. It needs to address interests of tribes, including the protection of tribal cultural and archaeological resources and culturally significant viewsheds and any other areas of interest. Of course, it has to have standards related to protection of the environment and marine species. And then also it needs to have standards in there that would support the achievement of state energy and climate policy goals. But I do want to emphasize what the roadmap is and what it isn't. So first off, the roadmap is not going to be the place where the state decides whether offshore wind is going to happen or not. This is an effort to identify what the path might look like to offshore wind and what the policy needs of the state are to get there in a responsible way. But it is not the place where we will be creating new policy whole cloth or making decisions. The roadmap is a recommendation document that then would be submitted to the legislature to decide whether they want to move forward with any of the actions or policy changes that could come out of it. Within the roadmap, we're looking at different futures. So we're not just driving straight to offshore wind. We're considering some different ways that the state could move. And that includes a future where we don't have offshore wind, or kind of a middle ground where we try to build the supply chain around offshore wind elsewhere without actually hosting it ourselves. And then we look at different scales of offshore wind development that could happen in Oregon and whether there are differences in what our standards would be there. We're also looking at actions the state could take to be better positioned in the future, whether that be studies or engagement actions or various other things that we could do. And then we're also identifying what the staffing needs are at the state level, at the local level, so that we have the right people in place with the right expertise if this were to come. What you see here on the screen is a cartoon of the process that we've been following to develop this roadmap. I came into the position around September of last year, and by October, we had recruited a roundtable of about 50 members representing different interests and different areas around the state and along the coast to advise us on building this roadmap. We also began early with tribal engagement before our first roundtable meeting to work out how we were going to be engaging them moving forward. And we've established a separate table for the federally recognized tribes of the state to talk specifically about what their interests and concerns would be. This roundtable that I talked about has been meeting monthly since November, and they're all-day meetings. We've been hosting them along the coast, up and down, with hybrid options, open to the public with opportunity for comment at every meeting. Those are video, they're on YouTube, and you can find them on our website. Out of the roundtable, we also broke out some working groups to talk more focused manner on some specific topic areas, such as what the research needs of the state might be in order to make a risk-aware decision for offshore wind, or what the state's role ought to be and what are our guidelines for any community benefit conversations that need to happen so that the balance of loss and benefit is in the state's favor. And then there's a third working group that relates to marine spatial planning. This idea that if the federal process that identified those areas, if there were ways in which we as a state might do it differently, if we were to lead it ourselves, and is it worth us as a state going through that process to be proactive in identifying the places where it may or may not be suitable. We're also doing some community engagement work outside of the roundtables, recognizing that not everybody has the time and ability to participate in that way. So we've been doing some focus groups, or we're getting started on those. We're reaching out to some specific communities, and then we're doing public engagement events like the one that we're here tonight having, but also through the spring, we were in person along the coast in Seaside, Brookings, and North Bend, having the same kind of conversation that we're having here tonight.
Jeff.
Right? Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering, that maybe this is a time that Tammy can post the community survey that we have live. She could just post it in the chat.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, that's in the chat right now.
Great. Thanks. So what you see here also is the schedule. Right now, we're taking a break from the roundtable so that I can work with the feedback we've gotten. We're going to come back in around September and continue meeting through the late winter. And then once we have a draft that's ready for public review, we'll put that out for open public comment, probably next spring, with a plan to submit to the legislature and again, mid to late next year. Our roundtable, as I mentioned, we have been meeting monthly. We have an open email inbox as well, where you can send any thoughts or questions or comments you have directly to us. And then we have that email listserv on our website where you can find more information about the roadmap. The roadmap itself, the outline of how we're structuring this is to start with just an open background of where we are with offshore wind in the world and in the state, talking about those alternative futures that I mentioned of here are the different ways the state could go and what some of the considerations are. We have that policy assessment to say, where do we need to sharpen our tools? And then we have strategic planning elements and an action plan where we say, if we want to keep offshore wind on the table for the future, what are those elements of the path where the state needs to be taking action, making investments, or helping things to to become more clear in the future. And I want to pause for just a moment here. If we have some members of our roundtable who are here tonight and are willing to talk for just a moment about what made you decide to participate in that and what your interests are, what your experience has been, I'd like to invite anyone who wants to speak up for just a moment to raise your hand. If we don't, it's okay too. Just a moment. We'll carry on. So with our roadmap conversations, where we began was to just try to identify the whole universe of offshore wind effects, both the things we would want to see and the things we would not want to see. And we made a 25-page list of all the things that anyone could think about. And then from there, we took a look at the policies we have in the state, the laws that are on the books, the rules that we have in place, to see if we could match up every one of those effects to a policy that we have. And if we couldn't, that was an indication to us that we may have a gap there that needs some sort of action to remedy. So that's one portion of the conversation that we've been having to date. You can find that list of effects on our website. And if you have any trouble finding it, please reach out. I'm happy to share it with you. And if we missed anything, that would be good feedback. And then beyond just where the effects and the policy gaps are, there have been some other things bubbling up in the conversation that I wanted to make you all aware of. First off, we spent some time trying to identify, if this is a roadmap, what are the waypoints along that path? What are the places that you actually need to go? What are the steps along the way that you can't skip if you're going to do this the right way? And trying to map that out along the different phases of offshore wind development so that we could be really clear with ourselves what we would want to see happen. And then there's that policy gaps piece that I've already talked about, as well as the marine spatial planning piece, which is the subject of one of our working groups, to ask ourselves, if we were going to do some spatial planning ourselves, what would be important to us? What would we want to consider in that? What would we do differently as something for the legislature to consider? We've had a lot of conversation as well about uncertainty and risk. There are aspects of offshore wind that are known in other places of the world. And then there are aspects of the fact that there's some new technology involved here that leave some uncertainty. And then there's also the uncertainty of we have a different environment here. We have the California Current large marine ecosystem, this current of water that comes from our north blowing winds or from the north that creates the upwelling that then creates the base of the food chain that supports so much life. And there are questions about, well, what would the effect be if we started to extract some of that energy for ourselves, as well as what could different effects be from having infrastructure out there, having more people out there in the ocean conducting activities. And so how do we as a state get to a place of comfort where we could even make a decision whether to proceed or not? And when do we need to know that information? As part of that, we've been talking about what a state-specific research agenda should look like, and then also coordinating with Washington and California, who share that large ecosystem, to say what are ways in which we can be learning together. As I also mentioned, we've been talking about community benefits. What are ways in which communities would want to be involved in the conversation around what benefits to them could be to offset any potential losses? What should the role of the state be in those conversations, either as a referee, a facilitator? Should we stay out of it? And then a question of how do you make those enforceable? How do you make them have teeth so that the things that are promised actually come to pass? We've also been hearing from the industry that, one of the reasons why 4 of the 5 bidders dropped out is that there are some barriers in the state to developing offshore wind. And there are some risks from that side too, where in order to move forward, they would need to see certain market signals, certain indications that offshore wind is wanted and viable and of interest to the state. And so we've been trying to identify what those might be along sometime in the future. And we've also been talking about this concept of exit ramps, again, with the roadmap analogy. Are there points in the process where if we don't have the information we need, or if there's an agreement that we're waiting for that we don't have, is that a time when the state ought to pull over? And at that point, are we just pulling over into a rest stop until we get the thing we're looking for and then we continue on? Or are there situations where we just decide this path is not for us? And so we've been having those conversations as well, trying to identify what those thresholds and triggers would be, both to leave the road and then potentially get back on it. So that's where we've gotten with the roadmap conversations so far. We've just gotten a ton of feedback, and our facilitator in the process likes to call it the top of the funnel. So we have just a lot of feedback right now. And I've converted that into about like a 40-page draft that you can find on our website right now that is really just for discussion. And from that, I'm going to be spending the summer taking the feedback that I received in the last couple of months from our roundtable, and if we get any other feedback from the public, and turning that 40-page starter draft into something more substantial that then we can all work together on and try to get to a final place. So that's what I'm going to be doing over the summer, is expanding that document so we can come back in the fall. And now I want to switch gears a little bit. And as I mentioned before, talk about what we think offshore wind might look like in Oregon. And first, talking about, again, where the state's main lever is with this federal consistency authority. We have the ability to expand beyond just state waters. We have this thing, it's called a GLD, and it allows us to review a project all the way out to 500 fathoms, which gets us out into the areas that BOEM identified. And we get to apply state policies in federal waters, which gives us a pretty powerful position there. And so if we have a policy that applies to an effect that we're seeing, we can then be reviewing against those policies. And as I mentioned before, we have those 3 options. We can concur, we can object, or we can concur with conditions, that yes, if, and that's our opportunity there. But also there would be portions of an offshore wind project that need to come to shore, the cabling, any onshore facilities, those kinds of things. And so there would also be authority at the state and at the local level for anything that's onshore that would be part of the process as well. And so any project would need to obtain those permits in order to move forward also. When we're reviewing a project, we are able to review a variety of types of effects that cover a lot of different use and resource areas, as you can see on the screen there: cultural, natural, economic, recreational, and aesthetic. We also can look at cumulative effects and effects that are separated by space and time that might be indirect. So it gives us a pretty broad window to look through. But when we're talking about what an offshore wind system might look like, there's a mixture of things that could happen offshore and onshore. Offshore, you would see floating foundations, those yellow things you can see on the screen, that would be moored to the seafloor, and there would be electrical cables, not only from the turbines to shore, but there would also be cables in between the floating foundations. So if you imagine like a daisy chain, if you had 30 turbines out there, they would all be collecting power into one area using that daisy chain so that there could be fewer cables that have to get all the way to shore. You would need a substation that can collect all that power and put it into one cable. And it's not yet known whether that would be something that also floats, or people have also talked about maybe putting it on the seafloor itself, but there would be challenges either way there. You'd also have increased transportation offshore as you have installation vessels for cables and anchors and foundations and all that, as well as maintenance crews and other kind of support vessels out there. When you get onshore, we're talking about a cable that needs to go under the beach until it can reach a manhole in the ground, connect to the grid. It would need to connect to existing substations to get to the larger state grid. And then you would have onshore facilities that help put these things together and maintain laydown yards for equipment. And then you also need to have changes to support the workforce that would be doing that work. So that would be housing needs. There would be effects to the local economy onshore. One of the reasons why offshore wind is attractive to some is that you can build things a lot bigger. You're not constrained by highways and what you can fit on a truck in terms of blades or spars. And so you can build it right on the shoreline and then tow it out. And that lets you get bigger and bigger and have a larger energy generating capacity for every single turbine. And where we are today is in the roughly 15 to 17 megawatt size, which is that large one that you see there. And the hub in the center is about 500 feet high. And the very top tip of a blade would reach about 1,000 feet at that size. Here you can see an example of an offshore wind turbine. This is one that is fixed to the seafloor. So it's a post stuck in, and it has these different parts to it that you can see there on the screen. The fixed bottom, which is the ones on the left, and then on the right would be different concepts of what a floating wind turbine might look like. There's still effort being made to come to a single design that works the best. And so we're not really sure what an offshore wind turbine foundation would look like at this point. And there are pros and cons to any one that we would see. And then, as I mentioned, there would be cables in the water, both electrical cables and then also the mooring lines and cables that would be holding these in place as they're floating. What's here on the screen is an example of an offshore wind floating turbine array that is in existence today off the coast of Scotland. One of my colleagues went there last year and took this photo. And so you can see there, these are, I think, 9 megawatts in size, so not quite the big ones. But here you can see another set of pictures that shows what they look like up close. And they are large, you can see there on the screen. Here are some more photos again, just to show you what they look like out there. As I mentioned before, we're not just talking about equipment, we're also talking about people. There would be a need for a new industry and support, and that would mean jobs and job opportunities, but it would also mean growth stresses potentially on communities to support those workers and provide essential services in the community. And here on the top photo, you can see an example of one of those substations I talked about that aggregates the power. Again, this is in shallower ocean waters, and so they're able to put theirs on stilts. But if we were to have it here in Oregon, it would either need to be floating or on the bottom. And then on the lower picture, you can see the size of the vessels that are typically used for laying cable, moving components, et cetera. So you need to have port space and capacity to support those kinds of vessels. You would also need portside facilities to act as laydown yards and assembly areas where you could put the different pieces together. So you would need tall cranes, space that is accessible by boat in order to make it happen. And you would need anchors, really big anchors. This is my colleague Andy standing in front of one of the anchors in Scotland that they use for the offshore wind project there. And those would be towed out and embedded. Then there are different kinds of anchors. So again, it's kind of the technology is still landing on its best solution. And then once you get onshore, as I mentioned, you have to bring your electrical cable under the beach to a place where you can connect it to the grid. And this is actually a picture from Oregon. This is the vault that the Oregon State University Wave Energy test site that's off, just south of Newport, where their cables come in. And it's at, Driftwood Beach State Park. If you go there, you'll see 4 manholes in the middle of the parking lot, and this is what's under them. Now I want to show you some pictures of what it might look like from shore if there were offshore wind turbines off of Oregon. What you see here as a first shot is what it would look like if there was an array of fixed bottoms. So they tend to be smaller. And in this case, they're only about 2 miles offshore, which is not what we would really see in Oregon, but you could see that they would be really visible from shore. This next photo is those floating turbines that I showed you the picture of when they were on the boats and out there. And if you were on shore seeing them, they're about 9 miles off in this photo. And again, they're 9 megawatt size, so they're not quite the size that we would be likely to see in Oregon. And now what I want to show you are some simulations. These are images that the federal agency BOEM commissioned when they were doing their siting process for Oregon, where they went to some viewpoints on the coast, took some photos, and then put in there what it would look like if there were turbines in those places. And so this is a view from Brookings, looking out into the Brookings wind energy area, which again is about 18 miles at its closest point from shore. And this is a view from Harris Beach. And you can see there just at the horizon line, those little white spars sticking up. And if you were to zoom in, that's what you would see there. And you can find there are some YouTube time-lapse videos that are on the BOEM website where you can actually see what it would look like in a 24-hour period, at sunset and at night when they have their red lights blinking, etc. This next one is from the Coos Bay area, and this is looking to the Coos Bay wind energy area that was 32 miles offshore, so even further, and what it would look like if there was an array out there. And it's kind of hard to see from this photo, but if you would zoom in, what you would see is that a large portion of them are past the horizon, but not all. And so there would potentially be on a clear day when there isn't the haze effect, you might see them out there. And then, as I mentioned, for those of you who are in a dark enough room, the center point of those turbines has lighting for aircraft safety and marine safety that would be on a blink. There are proposals and projects where they have radar activated lights so they wouldn't be on year round. And that's something we've been thinking about as well. Now thinking about how much could there be? In Oregon, there was a bill a few years ago that created a planning goal of up to 3 gigawatts of floating wind, but it wasn't a hard and fast directive or goal or anything like that. And there was a study from Pacific Northwest National Lab that found that if you didn't make any changes to the grid as it stands today, and if you spread out the offshore wind from north to south, you could accommodate about 2.5 gigawatts. So that's about 2 nuclear power plants worth of energy if you spread it there. And you can see there, those 5 red squares, that's where the 5 power lines that come across the Coast Range connect. And so if you wanted that power to be able to move around the state, you would need to connect to one of those areas. If you were to put an array offshore, you would also need to space them out because they can create wind turbulence that interfere with one another. And the rule of thumb is that at the size we're talking about, they would be approximately a mile apart. And that would be, forward and back or side to side. And then there's also work being done to look at how to optimize how you connect them to the seafloor. And this idea that you might have sharing of the mooring lines and such. And so if you had an array, you might have a shape that looks like what you can see here on the screen, from a top-down perspective, where each one of those red Ys on the right side would be a turbine, and each black dot would be an anchor, and then you would have the lines going between them. So then I got curious. And last year, when we were doing our federal consistency review, I took this image with the distances there, and I took this image, which was the areas that had been identified by BOEM for wind energy, and I asked someone in our staff to just speculate with me. How many do we think we could fit in an area like that? And so we tried it out. And this is not, no one has proposed this. This is just me being curious and playing around. And we also, as part of this, applied one of our state policies that would eventually apply in the future that says, if there is a rocky habitat on the seafloor or a sensitive habitat like a thermal vent or coral or something like that, you have to stay 1,000 feet away from it. So we said, okay, well, if we applied that, what would we get? And so that's what you see there. And just really ballpark estimate, I was guessing you could fit maybe 40 to 50 turbines there that would have a maximum capacity of anywhere between 600 and 750 megawatts. If you were to look at the Brookings wind energy area that was identified and did the same exercise, there's more area that needs to be avoided, those white areas, because there are known rocky habitats there. And so you can't have quite the same configuration. And again, the estimate is 60 to 65 turbines, maximum 900 to about a gigawatt of capacity that could go there. But again, this is just for estimate purposes, trying to think about how much sea space would be needed in order to meet different energy goals. So again, we get those 2 bites of the apple, one at the leasing stage, one at the review of the actual project they want to build. And when we get there, we have a large number of policies that we get to apply. We have our planning goals. We have our territorial sea plan that has a specific chapter dedicated to marine energy. We also have some policies that relate to protecting the optimal use of fish for food purposes and commercial fishing that we would use as a basis for mitigating any effects to uses from the fishing community. We also have a number of environmental protection policies, as well as policies that protect archaeological resources like shipwrecks or historical tribal resources, that kind of thing. So when we would do a state review, we'd be looking at fish and wildlife concerns and policies, effects to fishery uses, as well as marine transportation. We do have some viewshed policies in the state that would be applicable for what you'd be able to see from shore. There would be local policies at the city and county level for anything that touches the shore and enters into their jurisdiction. So really, we're talking about cable landings and onshore facilities. We have some policies in the territorial sea plan that direct how to do subsea cables and marine renewable energy facilities themselves. And then we as a state would be coordinating and consulting with tribes who have an interest to bring those interests into our review as well. So I'm almost done. The last thing I want to talk about is what opportunities members of the public, the state, have to shape the roadmap from where we are today. And the big ones are, as I mentioned before, helping us to identify concerns and benefits. What are those areas that we need to be thinking about as we are doing that policy assessment to make sure that there aren't gaps and to look for where we might need to fill a gap, both for something we want to avoid, but also maybe something that we could benefit from that we want to capture. We're also interested in feedback on what those waypoints are along the path, those steps you can't skip if you're going to do this the right way. And we've been developing some diagrams that kind of lay out what we think the path might look like as a starting place that we'd be open to feedback on there. We also tonight have a survey that we've been taking to our public meetings that we're going to put on our website later that asks some basic questions about, if you were in charge, what's a policy that you would want to see the state have? What are some questions that you think really need to be answered before you feel like you would be ready to make a decision about whether offshore wind has a place in the state or not? Those kinds of things. And we'd be really interested in any feedback you can give us for that survey.
And the
We
link is
also-
in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you, Tammy. As I mentioned, on our website, we're also posting all of our meeting materials, and that includes drafts of the roadmap. If you want to go look at the June meeting that just happened on our website, you'll see a draft of the roadmap that's been marked up by our roundtable members. And that's the draft that I'm going to be working from this summer, building out from there. So if you want to add your comments, your observations, and send them to our email address, I'm happy to have them. And then finally, if you want to come to a roadmap meeting, either stuff like this, or come to one of our roundtable meetings, either in person or virtually, and make a comment. We'll have 2 opportunities at every meeting for someone to come and have that conversation. Last thing I want to show you is a sneak peek at these waypoint diagrams that I was mentioning. We had an earlier version that I just made myself. And then based on the feedback we've gotten from our roundtable, we commissioned a graphic designer to help us try to make it make a little more sense. And so there are pieces that I'm going to show you first here that are kind of components, and then I want to kind of roll through what we've got. First, we have these ongoing streams, things that we know we want to be having throughout the entire offshore wind process that would touch on meaningful engagement, making sure we have the right information at every phase, and then coordinating regionally. We would then have these large circles, these gates, that there are different phases of an offshore wind project, from siting and planning, to leasing, to permitting, to construction, to operations, and then to decommissioning or keep it on going and renewing your lease. And at each stage, there are things that we want to make sure we've got in our pocket before we walk through that gate and go on to the next stage. And so we're trying to identify those. And we're identifying those around these objective areas that came from the original House bill and those interests that the roadmap needs to touch on. So here's an example of one at the very first stop along the way. And you can see on the left, starts with federal siting and planning and moves on down through the life cycle. That at the siting and planning stage, we have a meaningful engagement stream where we're engaging tribes and the public. We're seeking good information through having a state research agenda that we're acting on and building that agency capacity to have that expertise. And then doing regional coordination through making maybe a science collaborative where people are working together and looking at the science together, trying to reach a consensus, as well as having regional power conversations. There would be then some specific things that we would do with the different interest areas, including looking at community investment needs, having a port infrastructure and supply chain plan. For the workforce, building a framework for those enforceable agreements that I talked about, those things that have teeth, as well as quantifying job benefits. On the environment side with the whale, we would be looking at things like state-led marine spatial planning so that we can avoid those areas that are of most use by the sea life and others, and then working with that research agenda and research collaborative to answer those environmental questions we might have. And then on the energy side, there's that state energy strategy that's being developed by the Department of Energy, where we would look for signals coming out of that offshore wind fits with the state's overall strategy. And then additional market signals such as policies, markets, or incentives that could reduce the risk for development, as well as transmission needs, that's a piece of the system as well. As you move on to leasing, I won't dwell on each one. These will be posted on our website, so you can take a look yourself and study and tell us what's needed. But you can see that the things you need to have in your pocket before you move through the gate are different at every phase. And that's the process we've been going through with our roundtable. And then when we get to permitting, there are a lot of things that would need to happen because this is the state's second bite of the apple where we need to see a lot of information before we would be willing to consider moving forward. You get into construction, where you've passed the permitting phase. What are those things that we need to see in place in order to feel comfortable continuing on? And then an operation phase, which could be, around 30 years, where you have something out there and you're conducting ongoing monitoring, you're honoring your agreements, you're adapting as you learn new things, so that you can be reducing any potential harm that might come and capturing those benefits. And then at the end of your 30-year-ish period, you would then take all the things you learned and decide whether it's something you want to do again or whether it's something you don't want to do again. And then you would proceed on to decommissioning. So again, these will be posted on our website in the next couple of days, I would say. And then we'd be looking for any feedback you have, including if that even speaks to you, if that way of presenting that path is effective and makes sense. So I'm going to wrap up here and turn it over to you all to ask questions. But again, if you want to stay tuned with what we're up to, we are doing some additional engagement this summer. We have the listserv where you can sign up for emails, come to a meeting, and then look for a full draft of the roadmap sometime probably early next year. And then as Tammy put in the chat, here's a link to the survey that if you have a few minutes, it's not a long survey. We'd love to hear from you on that. And now with that, I want to turn this meeting over to anyone here tonight who has a question, who wants to express something to us to be considered in the roadmap development process. Please, if you're interested in talking, you can just say so in the chat and we'll put you in line. You can raise your hand. If you would prefer not to speak, you can put your question in the chat and then we can address it that way as well. And depending on how many people we have, we've got about 45 minutes we could keep running. And so we'll just keep going.
Jeff, we had a question early on from Kimberly Mandel. Kimberly, do you want to ask your question? Are you able to unmute?
Okay, I did it. I did it. I did it. It was just, I didn't notice when they were giving the species that they studied, the effects or the potential harms, the eelgrass wasn't on there. And I'm pretty ignorant on stuff. I mean, it could be, oh, it doesn't even grow there, but I was just curious. I know that's an important part of our ecosystem here in Coos Bay.
Absolutely.
And I didn't see that.
Yeah. Obviously, when you're talking about the deep water offshore, that's not a thing. But if there were going to be development in Coos Bay to support an offshore wind industry, and really when you look at the coast, Coos Bay is kind of the only port that has the capabilities that would be necessary for some of the really big assembly pieces that you would need, from the studies we've seen, there would need to be modification of the navigation channel to make it wider and deeper. The proposed intermodal port for Coos Bay, the shipping terminal, would need similar changes as well. But we do have policies in the state that are there to mitigate any effects to habitat, to protect wildlife. And so if there were a shoreside facility proposed to support offshore wind industry, there would be, eelgrass would be in the mix as we are reviewing that project.
Is there any residue or anything that would come off of the shore that could affect the waters closer inland, like you're saying? Is there any, running any kind of operation?
Yeah, well, anytime you're running boats, there would be the potential and the risk that there could be spills or something like that. And that exists today. We have also heard concerns from people who've experienced it firsthand out in the gorge or who have heard or seen about it in offshore settings that the hydraulic oils used in the turbines might have the potential to leak. And so that would be something that we are looking at our policies and how they can address that so that we can then have that information and look for solutions or maybe have that be a reason. And I see Cynthia, you're coming off mute. Do you want to add?
Thank you
Oh.
very much for the answer.
Yeah.
No, I don't have
Go ahead,
anything else
Cynthia.
to add to that. Yeah, I just was, before we went to Heather, I just wanted to make sure we got an answer to
Well, yeah,
Ron's
there's one
question.
before that, Doug was next in line.
Well, first was the question about the fisheries meetings. Ron, I don't know if you wanted to ask that question. If you, looks like you came off mute. Oh, his mic's not working. Okay, so his question was that, I'll just read it. I've heard earlier in the meeting that there are fisheries focused meetings tomorrow. Are those open to the public or are they invite only? Is there a link to participate remotely? And I know, Jeff, I wanted you to be the one to make that.
Sure. Yeah. So we're looking at those as like a kind of like a focus group. And our outreach for these ones is mostly focused on the commercial fisheries. But I've heard there's an interest in opening it up to the recreational fisheries as well in a next meeting. And that one we could open more broadly. I guess I would say that we did the invites specifically for fishing communities because we're really trying to make sure we hear from those voices. And, you know, if we had multiple hundred people there, it could be an effect. But at the same time, it's not closed. So if you were interested, send me an email and see. I'll check with my management, but I think we could probably make that happen.
Doug, you'd had a comment. Do you want to talk about that or ask Jeff a question or follow up?
Yeah, I skipped over Doug, but I know
That's
he had
okay.
he was very appreciative of providing more clear information. And that
Oh, I'm sorry. It looks like Doug
Yep.
unmuted.
Okay, Doug, go ahead. I know you also had a question.
Yeah, I just thought my written question made the point, but were these state planning efforts federally funded? And if so, are the funds at risk under the new administration?
Thank you. The roadmap that we're doing right now was funded by the legislature out of the Oregon General Fund. So the work that we're doing from now until the end of next year is not affected by federal funding. However, in our conversations, you know, we're talking about we have potentially some research needs that we want to pursue. And the federal government has been doing studies offshore looking at bird distributions, doing studies of various monitoring technologies, et cetera. And there is concern that those activities and the funding for them might stop. And then for anything that the state wants to be a part of or have answered, there is the question of, well, who would support that financially? Would the state need to pony up our own money to be doing these research effects or to be researching these things? Is there partnership with industry that could be pursued? Might there, is it feasible if we don't have federal support as part of that? And those are things we're grappling with.
All right, Cynthia, looks like Heather's up.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks, Heather, for waiting.
Oh, no worries. I just have a comment. My name is Heather Mann. I'm the executive director of the Midwater Trawlers Cooperative. We're based in Newport, Oregon. I also coordinated an informal group of commercial and recreational fishing interests and others who had an interest in understanding offshore wind and had concerns about the development. And I've been deeply involved in the process, or was deeply involved, I think, for about 4 or 5 years, I was a co-chair with two other folks, one from labor and one from renewable energy, developing the points that the roadmap group then picked up and worked with. And so I just wanted to say, Jeff, I'm just so grateful and appreciative of the work that you've done. I'm not supportive of offshore wind at this time, but I commend the state and you in particular. In all the years I've been doing this work, I've never heard such a great and really fair description of the different points that you provided in the opening. I'm really impressed with your ability to boil that down. And I think that even as someone as myself who has, really strong concerns, I think that you're doing a really fair job of pointing out what the potential opportunities are, but also the potential concerns and where the state has a really important role. And, I thank the governor as well as the natural resources manager and Oregon Consensus as well. In helping getting us to the place we're at, but really just couldn't let the evening go by without just really congratulating you on your abilities and what you've accomplished. Like I said, even as someone who is at this point pretty concerned about offshore wind development, I think that you've done a fantastic job of laying everything out. So I wanted to thank you publicly for that. Thanks.
Thank you. Shucks. Doug, I see your question. Are the slides going to be posted somewhere? Yeah, actually, the slides from the Brookings public meeting the North Bend public meeting from last month, which are basically the same as these, are on our website now. The only difference is that the waypoint diagram was the old version that wasn't as pretty. But I'll post this updated one tomorrow.
You want to run the polling questions?
Sure. So we did have a couple of polling questions just because we wanted to get a sense of who was here tonight. If you're willing, we'd love to hear from you. It's just 2 questions, and it'll help us a little bit. And in the meantime, is there anybody else who has any questions on the process? Anything you want to say? Things that you want to make sure that we don't lose sight of?
It looks like polling is kind of slowed down. Should we go to the next question?
Sure.
I think both questions were included in that launch.
Oh, do you have to scroll down to see it?
Yeah, you have to scroll
Oh,
down.
you have to scroll. You didn't. Okay, one at a time. All right. Scrolling down. Are you able to scroll it down so we can see it, or is it just for participants?
You should be able to scroll it down.
Yeah, you should be able to scroll it down. I scrolled it down.
Well, while folks are doing that, I'll just put my contact information on the screen again. If you have questions, if you want to chat, this is how you can reach me. I'm just going to be reading and writing this summer and doing stuff like this. And I guess do a last call. Anyone, if you have anything to ask or anything to say, please chime in.
I'm curious if anybody at this meeting attended any of the in-person meetings. I'm guessing not, but just curious.
I think not seeing any others. Thank you for coming and learning. I hope to hear from you if you want to take our survey or reach out. But with that, I guess we'll let you all have a nice evening. I hope. We'll see you around.
Thanks, Jeff. Good night.